Welcome back to another episode of What's on Tap. Today we're going to discuss the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. Before we get going into the act, we're going to give introductions to everyone. My name is Andrew Condiles. I focus on collection work in both Pennsylvania and New Jersey. With me also today is Cameron Deane. He also does collection work in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and also does some bankruptcy work. In addition, I've got Scott Best, who focuses practice on New Jersey collections work. Before we start talking about the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, we're going to discuss today's beers. Today's beer is a Cape May IPA. As the name suggests, it's brewed in Cape May, New Jersey, which is at the very southern tip of the state of New Jersey. If you ever happen to visit Cape May, I definitely suggest you go and visit the brewery in Cape May. Good tour, good food, and pretty good time.
It's a good place to bring your kids on a cold and cloudy day at the shore if you're down there in the summer.
Very nice. All right, so what is the TCPA? The TCPA, broadly speaking, covers communication from an organization to consumers. And pretty much all for-profit organizations, including credit unions, are governed by this law. And there are four basic components to this law that we're going to be discussing today. There's the do not call list, the call timing and content requirement restrictions, restrictions on the use of ATDS, and limitations on pre-recorded calls. So, Kim, tell me about the National Do Not Call List. Is that when you talk to a telemarketer and you say, don't call me back? Or what exactly is the National Do Not Call List?
Sure. So, again, as Andy mentioned, the TCPA has been enacted, and part of that law is the creation of this National Do Not Call List. So it's actually a list, I believe, maintained by the FTC, so a separate entity, but it is still applicable under the TCPA Act that we're here discussing today. What it is a list that any individual can put their name on by contacting the FTC and requesting to be put on it. So it's important to understand this if you're an organization, as Andy discussed, not just from a collection standpoint, but for any type of telemarketing business. It is important to understand that you always need to do a check of this National Do Not Call List that is maintained by the FTC to ensure that you are not going to inadvertently contact an individual who is on that list. Basically, once a person requests to be on that list, that request must be respected, and it remains the case regardless of a change in phone number, a change of address. The request to be on that list relates to the person.
Okay. Now, all right, that's a pretty broad restriction. Are there any exemptions to this rule? Can you ever call anyone who's on the National Do Not Call List?
So there are some exceptions as it relates to the National Do Not Call, or the DNC list, as we generally refer to it as. So one of the first exceptions is if there's an existing business relationship. So, for example, Andy might call and put his name on the DNC list, but then he'll reach out to your bank or your credit union and engage in a transaction. He will open a checking account, he will take out a personal loan, whatever the case is. The establishment of that business relationship acts as an exemption on the DNC list. Essentially, the rule is if there is a business relationship established and there is any sort of transaction that occurs within 18 months prior to your attempt to reach out, this DNC list does not apply. You're accepted from that if that person's name appears on the list. Now also, if the person's name is on the DNC list, you can contact them despite that for purposes of debt collection. So that's the other major exception that we deal with in our day-to-day practice, as does our clients. But the one caveat there is your contact with them must relate specifically to debt collection. So you cannot get two for the price of one, meaning you can't reach out to a customer who's got an outstanding obligation and then finish the call by saying, by the way, we're offering some great rates on personal loans here. That is something that would be in violation of the DNC list that you are prohibited from contacting them about. But again, if your contact is limited to the purpose of debt collection because of that prior existing relationship, then you're free to reach out to them. Now, Scott, I know you have kind of talked about this topic in other webinars too, but just want to make sure you spoke on the FDCPA. Is there a separate issue related to like the cease and desist and this do not call list?
It's more with regard to under the FDCPA or most of your state collection requirements. If someone says don't call me, even though under the exception to the DNC contact list for the purpose of collection, you can contact them. But if they say, don't call me, you then, under the FDCPA or applicable state laws, you then have to not contact them anymore, even though the DNC list, you have the exception if they do request the cease and desist, then you have to abide by that. You can't say, well, I have an exception. That won't work.
So to put it a little differently, that supersedes any sort of exception that the national.
Yeah, and so organizations should probably keep their own list.
Right, well, that's an interesting question. So does the FDCPA require, is it just an optional thing that they can do, or are organizations required to create their own list of people who don't want to be contacted?
I think you're referring to the TCPA, but yes.
Yeah, I apologize.
So
TCPA,
in addition, similar to what Scott was just discussing with the FDCPA, the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, I know it can be confusing with the acronyms, that has a cease and desist component to it where if a consumer doesn't want to be contacted, you can't contact them. Now back to the TCPA, it actually provides for an organization being required to maintain a do not call list as well. So what that is just like the national DNC list, if a individual contacts a specific organization and says do not contact me, that is actually a separate list for the same purpose that organization must now maintain. So as we already covered, if a person calls and requests to be put on that list, then that organization must respect that request.
And how quickly is it, make the request, they have to do it within a month, in a year? How quickly does that request have to be honored?
Well, sure. So the Act does provide for a bit of a reasonableness factor here. And what we're thinking about in providing this, the answer is 10 days. You have up to 10 days to make sure that that name is added to the list and that request is being respected. Generally, the reason those grace periods are built in is because, practically speaking, an individual might call or receive a call, ask to be put on the list, and then whoever that front-end individual is at the organization taking down that information, it has to go up through a chain. There's an organizational process involved. So the Act was drafted with that in mind. So there is a grace period built in of 10 days. But again, it's important to respect it and not to toe the line with that 10 days. That is for the creditor or for the organization's benefit, just to ensure that every step they need to take to make sure that name is on the list is followed. But it is not a free pass to continue contact up until 9 days. That's not what that is meant to be. And the last thing I want to point out on this topic of the organizational do not call list is that this is a request an individual might make, but is one that they can actually rescind. Now, for purposes of doing it, my advice to our clients is always request the most clear, express, and ideally written rescission of the request to be on the do not call list. You don't want to just take their word for it on a phone call. You want something in writing, as we always recommend for just about every scenario.
Right, documentation is definitely something that we emphasize here. Now, Scott, suppose they're not on a do not call list. Does the TCPA place any requirements on the content of the call, timing, things like that nature?
As far as timing goes, yes. You can't call before 8 a.m. You can't call after 9 p.m. That is the recipient's time zone, not your time zone. Sometimes this can be an issue because as people now rely on cell phones more than landlines, cell phones are transient, so you may have a Philadelphia or Cleveland area cell phone, but then you end up moving to Chicago, or not Chicago, California. You're going to have a very different time zone issue. So it's not, and you can't say, well, they have a Philadelphia area code, I'm allowed to call them. It's where they are currently located. Similarly, if you do make a call to someone, you have to include that the name of the person, the organization calling, and any contact information related to that organization. So it can't just be a blind call and then you refuse to provide any information.
Now, the TCPA also placed some restrictions on the use of these automatic telephone dialing systems. What does the TCPA say about the automatic? The acronym is ATDS. First off, what is an ATDS? I know the Supreme Court has kind of sort of defined it, some little ambiguity, but big picture, what is an ATDS?
So the ATDS, the concept of what it constitutes, was when I first started in this business of debt collection as an attorney. The concept of what would fall under the category of an ATDS was all over the place. The statute is general. It just has the equipment which has the capacity and store, telephone numbers to be called using either a sequential number or a random number generator. That's generalizing. There ended up being litigation throughout the country over what constituted an ATDS, and as is often the case, certain circuits were broad, certain circuits were narrow in what they categorized it as. So back in 2021, the Supreme Court, because there was the split, the U.S. Supreme Court came in and said that an ATDS is a system that stores or produces phone numbers to be called using a random or sequential number generator that automatically dials those numbers. So it doesn't necessarily, it cleared it up somewhat, but there has been subsequent litigation over the idea of whether a particular system falls under those definitions. So it is clearer, you see less, but this was an area for years that was an area of great controversy or great amount of litigation over what constituted an ATDS.
Okay, all right. So I'm hearing you right. It's a system that automatically big picture, I know there's some dispute. So big picture, it's a system that permits a call to be dialed automatically without someone.
Correct. Correct. It's a system that either you can load numbers in or it just randomly generates the numbers. Sort of like when a stereotypical dialing system that would dial 609-111-1111, and then the next one it would do 1112 and then 1113. It was indiscriminate in who it was calling. That's what falls under. If the system allows it to do that, that falls under the definition of an ATDS. And in order to call, you do need, especially with regard to cell phones, which I think we'll cover a little bit later, that you do need the express consent of the consumer before making an automatic, use the system to make an automatic call.
Okay, so put a little differently, the TCPA forbids the use without consent of an ATDS?
Calling a cell phone.
Calling a cell phone?
Yes.
But so if you're calling it, but what if you're calling a landline?
Landlines you're able to call so long as you comply with all the other restrictions, but there's not the cell phones, which most people that's the number they use for anything anymore. Those, absent express permission, they cannot call. And
what about, since we're talking about use of technology in making phone calls, what about artificial or pre-recorded calls? What does the TCPA have to say about that?
Unless they fall into one of the exceptions that we're set to discuss, unless they fall into one of those exceptions, you are not permitted to call a cell phone with an artificial or pre-recorded voice message. So you can't send out a blast voicemail that says there's lower interest rates or we're offering a great promotion. You can't do that. However, that's only to a landline or to a cell phone. If it is a landline, you're able to call and have those voicemail messages. However, you're still restricted. There are some other restrictions, so you can't call someone more than 3 times within a 30-day period. Even if you have consent with an ATDS.
Okay, all right, interesting. 3 times in a 30-day period. Okay, excellent.
And so, while there are general prohibitions, what are some of the I mentioned the exemptions. What would some of those exemptions?
Okay, yeah, good question. So when it comes to the use of pre-recorded messages and these ATDS systems, an organization can obviously use this technology with consent, subject to obviously other TCPA restrictions. And and even if there's no consent, the TCPA does permit the organization to call the customer under certain circumstances. And those certain circumstances include advising them of potential fraud, ID theft, things of that nature. And I think kind of good general rule would be it can't be used for marketing. But if it's something truly informational that's time sensitive, these technologies can be used to reach out to customers.
Actually, do you mind if I just expand on that real quickly,
Absolutely.
Andy? So, as you mentioned, there are these account issue exceptions as they're defined in the TCPA. So, just to put a point on it, those are calls that can be made using an ATDS system without the consent of the consumer. But again, they're very limited to those specific issues you just mentioned: fraud, identity theft, and then another one is any sort of potential security breach on the account. Now, just to get into a little bit of the details about what those emergency calls must include, the message being sent to the consumer must be sent in a way that there is absolutely no cost to the consumer receiving the message. So it can't be through, basically a version of toll calling or something along those lines that would cause an increase in their phone bill. There also, as you mentioned, there cannot be any sort of telemarketing element. So it's got to be for the very limited purpose of the issue that is the exception, either the fraud, the identity theft, or the potential security breach. So you cannot go offering a lower rate loan or anything along those lines. You can't be soliciting any sort of business. And a couple of fine points at the end, as we've discussed on several topics like this, the institution must be clearly identified in the call. There must be contact information left in that message. And it also must be brief. This is one thing that can really hang people up a lot. But if it's a phone call, it must be no more than 1 minute in length, and that is the length of the recorded message that we're talking about. If it's a text message, it must be no more than 160 characters. So relatively small limits that we're talking about. But again, the purpose of this exception is to notify the consumer of an issue, such as a fraud, ID theft, or security breach to their account. Because of how limited the purpose is, the idea is get the message to them that there's a potential account issue, they need to contact the bank or the credit union. Here's the number to do so.
Excellent. Excellent. I'll go back to the ATDS exceptions very quickly. We talked about consent, and if the customer provides consent, you can certainly reach out to them. However, if the customer revokes consent, you have to cease using the ATDS technology. And the FCC says that the customer can reach out via any reasonable means. And I wouldn't try to parse out what exactly reasonable is. If they send you an email, letter, anything kind of suggesting they don't want you to reach out to them with pre-recorded messages or the ATDS, I would view that as a revocation. All right, so we've been kind of discussing the TCPA and different aspects to it. What happens, Scott, if someone happens to violate the TCPA? Are there penalties?
The penalties under the TCPA are pretty severe, depending on the volume of your violation. So the TCPA gives the consumer a private right of action to file against the violating party. It also allows your state attorney generals, if you're deemed to be a repeat offender effectively, or a malicious or habitual violator of the rules, the attorney generals of your particular state will start to investigate you on behalf of the recipients of the call. If you do violate the TCPA or your conduct is deemed to violate, it's $500 is the violation per call. And again, if you're deemed to be a willful violator or a repeat offender, the call then becomes much more punitive. And it's $1,500 per call. So you can have a situation, I read of one where the award was ultimately overturned on appeal, but a jury awarded $925 million for calls plus their attorney's fees. I think it was $1.8 million in unauthorized or improper TCPA calls. That was reversed on appeal for other reasons, but that is significant, and a lot of these are filed as class actions, which as you know, the purpose of a class action, or not the purpose, but one of the downfalls of a class action is the attorney's fees that get sought, and they can become quite large. In another case I saw that was a class action, the attorney wanted over $50 million as part of his attorney's fee, which is absurd, but that's what they're going to ask for. But if it is a class action, it does proceed, your attorney fees bills are going to be well into the six figures at a minimum that'll be paid. So, and
not just your attorney's fees, the other side's attorney's fees, you're on the hook for both.
Yes, you'll have to pay your fees and the other attorney fees. So it is a significantly punitive, unlike the FDCPA, which is $1,000 per, the statutory violation is $1,000 per case. The TCPA, it's $500 per violation.
So we say
per call.
Right. So good point there. So if you call the same person 4 times and violate the TCPA on each of those calls, that would be
$2,000 to that person.
Plus attorney's fees.
Plus the attorney's fees to bring it. So that's just for 4. So if you do that over, and generally speaking, the way that these folks look is that if you're doing it to one person, you're doing it to a lot of people. So again, it's very good to make sure that you're in compliance with these rules, as it is a significantly punitive statute if you violate it.
Right, absolutely. And speaking of impact of a violation of TCPA, what other kind of consequences can an organization suffer if they do violate the TCPA?
So one is you lose your organizational reputation is damaged, because no one wants to be known as the business or the bank or the credit agent or credit union or collection agency that is known for calling you all the time, sending you messages you don't want, sending you calls you don't want, voicemails you don't want. So it has a tremendous reputational risk. I know, just like everyone, you get annoyed by getting random text messages or random calls from a group that you have no affiliation with, and you're asking, what in the world am I getting this call for? As I discussed the suit, if it's a class action suit, your defense costs plus your costs if you do found to violate, your costs for the attorney's bills can increase to be significantly more than your underlying violation cost you. And then you still have the risk of violating the TCPA. You also have the risk of violating other consumer protection statutes, or having the CFPB coming down on you with a regulatory action for one of the harassment, oppressive, violative conduct that they deem to be something that they want to get you on an enforcement action on. So again, that also, it's not just constrained to the TCPA, it can expand well beyond that.
So the effect can be cumulative, and that violation can be a violation of TCPA and a violation of FDCPA or some other law. So you could,
correct.
So those damages can certainly add up pretty quickly.
Yeah, they certainly can jump up for what is deemed as a minor violation, but if that minor violation snowballs into significantly larger bill that you're now on the hook for.
Interesting. Yeah. So I think it really underscores the importance of having your processes tight and in compliance with these rules, because to your point, the cost can add up very quickly. Thank you for watching the season finale of Season 2 of What's on Tap. Please feel free to participate in the survey that our marketing team is providing you. Also, please feel free to look at some of the other webinars that have been produced by some of the other Weltman attorneys, including Ask a Pro, Coffee with Casey, and Commercial Collections Corner. Also, please feel free to reach out to any of us at the email addresses outside the screen. Thank you so much.